everyone, welcome back to Country Cow Designs. I'm Jo, and in this video tutorial I'm going to show you how to make the Sedron backpack, which is our new sewing pattern. Now if you want to actually sew along with us and make this bag, you'll need to grab the pattern. It's for sale on our website countrycowdesigns.com. Otherwise you can just watch along and hopefully pick up some new sewing techniques and ideas. So this is by far the biggest bag that we have designed so far, and actually my husband Adam designed the bag and then I created the pattern around it. So you'll notice that we've got two options for this front pocket. We've got buckles and we've got magnetic snaps. So the buckles are a little bit harder, and if you're going to be doing buckles you need to be using rivets. So if you're not using rivets, just go with the magnetic snap version. Now you can see that this is a pretty big bag, and we've tried to incorporate lots of different options, because when it comes to a backpack, if you're making it for somebody for like school or work, you're going to want a lot of different options depending what they're doing, what they're using it for. So first of all, we have designed it to be created using like wax canvas for the exterior. So this is a wax canvas. This is 12 ounce or 400 grams per square meter. That is not the same as 400 denier. So you just need to check the grams per square meter or the ounce in weight. That gives it like a nice bit of structure on the outside, because wax canvas has got like a little bit more stiffness to it than standard canvas. And then on the inside we use waterproof canvas. We're using 18 ounce or 600 grams per square meter waterproof canvas. It's thick waterproof canvas. But by using these materials, we don't have to use any interfacing at all in the bag, and we have to use very little stabilizer. Now, with a bag this big, the last thing you want to do is spend like a whole day cutting out all of the pattern pieces and the interfacing. So that's why we've gone for these materials, because with these materials, you're not going to have to cut out any interfacing, you're not going to have to press anything on. It's going to be a big time saver. So we'll have a quick look inside and show you what we've got in the way of optional pockets. So we've got this laptop strap on the back, which is designed to hold a standard size laptop, and that just slips in there. Now I wouldn't recommend putting your laptop straight in like this. The bag doesn't have enough padding just to throw the laptop in, but if you've got a protective sleeve for your laptop, then this is absolutely perfect. Hopefully you can see that it fits really well in there, loads of space. So that's an optional extra doing the laptop strap. You don't have to if you don't want to. We've also got a bottle pocket for a standard size bottle. And that you can see is just a stretchy mesh pocket on the side. Again, totally optional. If you're not going to use it, you don't have to make it. Then we've got an interior zip pocket, which is a really good size inside. And we've got another optional pocket on the back. So this one's a bit more of a secure pocket. It's quite big. You can fit quite a lot in it. If you want to put like your phone or your wallet in it, and then it's against your back and nobody can get to it. So that's kind of a nice extra feature. Now, something else we've designed on this backpack is to have a grab handle built in, so that you don't have to have like an extra grab handle on top. So this just means that you can pick the bag up really quickly, but it's actually also part of the straps. Now, if you decide that you want to make this backpack out of different materials, I strongly recommend that you add interfacing and extra stabilizers. It will be very wobbly without it. So as this bag stands right now, it's just got what it needs in the pattern. It's got wax canvas for the exterior, waterproof canvas or WPC for the interior, and then it's got a little bit of stabilizer on the gusset and a bit on the back. It has no other interfacing, but if you are going with lighter materials, if you're using a lighter waterproof canvas, if you're using a lighter canvas for the exterior, or you're using quilting cotton, you will need to add interfacing and stabilizers, or your bag is just going to be a big floppy mess. This is our first pattern where we've included instructions in metric as well as imperial. So I know that was something that a lot of people wanted. It's never like as straightforward as you think, because they don't convert perfectly into each other. So if you're going through the pattern and you're thinking, well, she says that 1/4 of an inch is so many centimeters, and actually I think it's a little bit different, that's because we've had to round it up or round it down to get it to be in the right place. because we've realised that you don't want us to say, you know, 2.6 centimetres, because the ruler that you're using, the quilting ruler, only says 2.5 or 2 3/4 centimetres. So we've rounded up or rounded down to cater for that. But in the meantime, we've also made sure that whatever we round up or round down matches, so that your bag will still come out in like absolutely perfect, you know, without any issues. So just be aware of that. So there's a few extra little things like the piping that we've just got really brief instructions for at the end of the pattern, because that's not actually part of the pattern. This one is how your bag will actually look with the pattern with the magnetic snaps. But I wanted to show this one to you guys so you can see the buckle option too. We've also put in the pattern really brief instructions for where to place your bag feet if you want to put bag feet. So there's not a lot of hardware on this bag. You've got, you know, whatever you choose, buckles or magnetic snaps for the front. You've got 2 strap sliders, and you've got some rivets if you want to use them. You don't have to use rivets. So it's very little hardware, and if you're using heavyweight waterproof canvas, which is generally like £7 or maybe like $9 per metre, then this bag doesn't end up being too much of an expensive make. It totally depends on the materials you want to use, but if you wanted to use like heavyweight waterproof canvas for the inside and the outside, you could end up with a really, really affordable bag to make, because there's very, very little hardware going on here. So if you're wondering where to source wax canvas and waterproof canvas and anything else that you need for this bag, we're going to do a live YouTube session a couple of days after this one. So just, you know, turn on your notifications on YouTube, it will pop up and let you know. And what we're going to do is discuss suppliers in various countries, ones that have been recommended to us by customers and also ones that we've tried ourselves. So if you have any questions about sourcing materials, definitely take a look at that. If you are watching this when the video first comes out, join us for the live session, that would be great. And if it's your first time working with wax canvas, we've got a video all about working with wax canvas. So I'll link that now in the description so you can watch that and maybe learn some new techniques. Personally, I absolutely love working with wax canvas. It's much easier to sew than things like vinyl, but it's not forgiving. So if you make a little mistake like I did on this one, you'll be able to see my lovely needle marks. They're not coming out. I used a hairdryer on them to kind of soften them, but basically I got that caught when I was sewing and I wasn't paying attention. That kind of thing, you know, wax canvas isn't as forgiving, so just be aware of that. But other than that, it's really easy to work with. It's really nice. It's got like this lovely patina where all the marks show up on it. Yeah, it's really great material, and especially for this type of bag where we're going for like a rustic kind of look. So I hope you enjoy this video tutorial. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you like the video, give it a like. And you can check out the pattern and any hardware that you need for the bag. You can grab it from our website, countrycowdesigns.com. Step 1 of this pattern is preparation. So first of all, you need to decide which pockets you want on this bag. So as we showed in the intro, we've got the exterior zip pocket, the lining zip pocket, the laptop strap, and the bottle holder, which are all optional. So you can just skip all of those if you want to. But what you need to do is print out the cutting charts from the pattern, and then you can cross off any pieces that you don't need. Also, if you're using webbing for your straps, you can go ahead and cross those off too. So you can see with mine, I've cut out the labels from the cutting chart and I've attached them so I know what each piece is going to be for. I'm using this waterproof canvas, 600 grams per square meter for the lining. I'm using a navy waxed canvas for the exterior, and my wax canvas, if you've never used wax canvas before, you get this lovely patina when you crease it up. So by the time we finish the bag, it's going to have all of these beautiful marks on it. I'm using this tobacco brown cork for the base, and then I've got my stabilizers cut out. So I'm using Peltex for the gusset and the back stabilizer, and then I'm using foam for the strap anchor and the grab handle. When you're printing your pattern pieces, I recommend that you do it on a computer. Printing from a mobile device can sometimes cause problems with it printing at 97% or 102%. Make sure that you're printing it with no scaling at 100% actual size using Adobe software. That's your best chances of getting it to print correctly first time. Make sure that you check the test square There's a couple of other things that can happen that can cause your pattern to print out the wrong size. That can be that your software needs updating, your printer drivers need updating, or perhaps there's just a disagreement between your computer and the way that the pattern downloaded, so you can always try re-downloading it. Generally, you'll find that it will print out the right size first time, but I know sometimes computers just play up, don't they, and they can cause problems. Throughout this pattern, I discuss using fabric glue or double-sided tape, so I've got a bit of both. Whatever you decide to use, check it out and test it on your offcuts before you begin. Because some fabrics don't like the glue, they react badly. Maybe if it's a light colour, you can see the glue through afterwards. Some wax canvases don't work well with double-sided tape. So whatever fabric you're using, test it out on a scrap first before you get started. I'm also going to be using Wonder clips for this bag because with wax canvas and waterproof canvas, you don't want to use pins because the holes will be visible afterwards. And lastly, I've got my needles. I'm using Microtex Schmetz needles. So these are size 90 Microtex needles. They are absolutely brilliant for wax canvas and cork. And then I've got size 110 universal needles. So that's a size 18. And those are going to be for the final steps when we're putting the binding on, because we're going to be going through a lot of layers. So a nice big needle is going to help us out. Throughout the pattern, we're going to be using a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch, which is 1 centimetre. Step 2 is the top gusset. So let's get started on making our bag. I've got my zip here and my 2 zip pulls for the top of the bag, and I've got my top gusset pieces, 2 exteriors and 2 linings. Now the first thing I'm going to do, because I'm using zipper tape by the meter, I'm just going to melt the ends of this zipper. And what I find is that just stops it from fraying. So now I'm going to add a zip from each end, because what we want is we want the zips to be closing toward each other. Once you've fed each side into the zip, you just push down on this on a flat surface and just pull it on. Once your zip pulls it on, just grab one of your exterior pieces. And you want to make sure that's right side up, and then place your zip right sides down. So these are right sides together, and we're just going to clip that together. Once that's all clipped together, you just want to baste this with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now you'll notice that your zip is a little bit longer, so you just want to have it centered on this piece. Once that's sewn, grab one of your lining top gusset pieces and you want to place that on top so that this is right sides together with the exterior and the zip is sandwiched in between. Now that's clipped, I'm going to sew that edge with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance or thereabouts. I like to sew my zippers using my standard zipper foot, and I move my needle over towards the zipper tape. That way my standard foot will press up against the zip teeth. It'll give me a really straight edge and a really nice finish. And that for me comes out at about a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once that's sewn together, what we need to do is push both the lining and the exterior back away from the zip. So you want to get a nice straight edge on here. So just press it with your fingers. If you are using cotton, then you could use an iron, but with both of these fabrics, I'm just going to push it with my fingers. And hopefully you can see here that we've got a really, really straight edge. And that's because I was using my presser foot there as a guide. Once you've got a nice straight edge, you're going to top stitch this edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to close up the other 3 sides just by basting them. Now we're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. So grab your exterior piece and you want this to be right sides together with this edge of the zip. Okay, make sure it's lining up on these edges with the layer below. Now we're going to baste that with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so flip that over so that you're looking at the lining. And now you want to take your second lining piece and place this right sides down. So this one is right sides together with the first one, and clip that in place. Now there's a ton of different ways to do zips. A lot of people, rather than basting and then sewing like I am, they just like to sew them both on at the same time. A lot of people prefer to use double-sided tape, and some people prefer to put their zip pulls on after they've done this. So you can just play around until you find the way that you prefer, but this is my preferred method. I feel like I get the neatest possible finish, and that's what I'm going for. So now that's clipped together, I'm going to sew it with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you're going past your zips, make sure that you leave your needle in, lift up your presser foot, and then you can shimmy the zips out of the way. Now we're going to do the same as before and push that up away from the zip. Now, if this is your first time working with wax canvas, you will start to notice all of the little marks, okay? So you can see the tiny little marks here where it's been pushed up against the teeth. And as you go over it with a presser foot, you'll get little marks. And just generally, as you're working with it, you will get marks. That is absolutely fine. That is the characteristic of wax canvas. By the time you're done, it is going to be covered in marks. And it's going to make it look, it's almost got like a leather look about it, like it's got a patina. So that is part of the character. So don't worry when these little marks start showing up as you're sewing. Now I'm going to top stitch this again with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to baste the other 3 sides. Okay, so that is your top gusset done. So set that aside and we'll move on to the next step. Step 3 is an optional step, and this is for the laptop strap. So for this step, you're going to need your Velcro, you're going to need a piece of webbing and 1 lining panel. So the first thing you need to do is mark your panel. So I've marked a line as instructed in the pattern. So all the measurements for this sort of thing are in the pattern. I've also marked the center of the panel just there. Now I'm going to grab my piece of webbing and I'm going to fold one of these ends over by about 3/8 of an inch, but it's really not going to matter if it's a little bit more or a little bit less. And on the same side, make sure it's on the same side, you're going to do the exact same thing on the other end. So you want to make sure that both of these are folded over to the same side. Now I'm just going to zigzag stitch across here with a matching thread. Alternatively, you can just sew it with a box. You can kind of do whatever you want. We're just going to secure this edge, and we're also going to make sure that this doesn't fray in the future. Okay, so I've zigzagged this edge. You could also, if you're using nylon webbing, use a lighter just to kind of singe the edges and stop it from unraveling. Now I'm going to grab the hook side of my Velcro, and this is the edge with the fold, so you can see the fold here. And what I'm going to do, I've got sticky Velcro. I'm going to place this right up against the fold, and I'm going to try and center that down the webbing. Now, I don't recommend sticky Velcro because it really gums up your needles. So I have to clean my needle immediately after doing this, but it is kind of handy because it holds it in place. It's not strong enough though to just leave it as it is because it will come off quite easily. So I'm going to sew this on with a big box. When I'm using Velcro, I do find that I need to increase my top tension to make sure that my stitches underneath are neat. And I also make sure that I'm using a matching thread so that it's going to blend into this nicely. Now, sewing Velcro isn't a particularly nice thing. It's especially this hook side, it's not ideal. So what I always do is I change my needle afterwards, because personally I feel like it blunts my needle sewing these hooks. So once I have done that, I wouldn't change your needle specially. I would just say, if your needle, you know, make sure that you're using a needle that's on its way out anyway, and finish with this. So once you've finished fitting that, you just want to flip it over to the other side, and then we're going to work on this end. So you can see there is no fold on this end. And what we're going to do is we're going to place the fluffy Velcro on this end, and we're going to place it so it's in line with that fold on the other side. So you should be able to tell because of your stitching. And you want to have that nicely centered, or thereabouts. Mine's a little bit low, but I'm sure that'll be fine. And I'm going to do the same thing again and just sew this on with a box. Okay, now that those are both sewn on, you want to mark the center of your webbing, and you're going to place it on top of the line that you drew on your lining and match up those center marks. So I'm just going to do it so that it covers the line. Now, what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to use some double-sided tape to hold this in place. Once that's held in place, you just want to mark it in from the edge, and then we're going to sew a big box here. So that is your completed laptop strap, and then you should be able to strap your laptop in when it's in a padded sleeve, and that should fit most laptops. Now set this aside and we'll move on to the next step. Step 4 is the cargo pocket. So we're going to make the version with the magnetic snaps because I'm making this bag for my nephew and he wanted the snap version. If you're making it with the buckles, you're going to want to follow the pattern instead. So I've got my 2 cargo pocket flaps, exterior and lining. I've got my 2 cargo pocket pieces, exterior and lining, and I've got my main exterior panel. Now what I've done to start myself off is I've marked the line as indicated in the pattern, and I've also marked the center on that line. On the back of these cargo pocket flaps, I have marked 3/4 of an inch down. Now, when you're using wax canvas, the easiest way to mark it is simply to use an awl. Now, what we're going to do is fold this down to that line. So we're folding this down. This is the wrong side of the fabric that you're looking at right now. So my favorite tool for getting this seam to stay in place is a seam roller. And this just works really well on wax canvas. You can just press it with your fingers, and maybe you want to use some fabric glue to hold that down or something like that. I'm going to leave that up to you. And I'm going to do the same with my waterproof canvas. Now my waterproof canvas isn't staying in place so well, so I'm going to use some double-sided tape just to keep that down. On your lining flap, you want to mark it on the wrong side of the fabric. So that's my right side, this is my wrong side. And I've marked, according to the pattern piece, where I want my snaps to go. And then what I've done is I've marked the sides using the washer. So I'm just going to snip through each of these marks so that we can fit these magnetic snaps. Now I've also got an offcut of Decaville Light. Now you can use absolutely anything for this. You could use Peltex or fleece or foam or anything really that you want to use. But what I want to do is protect the back of this and give my washers a little bit more reinforcement. So I'm just going to cut off a couple of pieces, and I'm going to mark these as well. Okay, so grab one of your male magnetic snaps, so that's the bit with the knobbly bit, and push it through those slits. then you want to put your protective piece on there and then a washer. And push those prongs back. You want to make sure they're sitting nice and flat so they're not going to poke through the exterior. And on the other side, you just want to fit another male snap. So make sure that both of these are males. A lot of people also like to cover these prongs now to protect the fabric above. I've never had a problem with it, so I personally don't, but if you want to, you could just put some tape over those or some interfacing or something like that. Now I'm going to place my lining and my exterior flap pieces right sides together and clip them on all edges. When you're matching this up, the most important thing, in my opinion, is to make sure that this folded edge matches, because that we want to look neat later on. So I match that first and then I clip the rest into place. Now we're going to sew the curve, and only the curve, with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And make sure that you backstitch well at the top of these folded seams. So when I'm sewing wax canvas, I generally use a stitch length of about 3, but when I get to these curves on the flap, I like to reduce my stitch length, because sewing curves is much easier with a shorter stitch length. So I go down to maybe a 2 or a 2.5 as I'm going around these curves. Okay, so once you've sewn that, I would recommend just using pinking shears or something like it on these curves. It will help it to lay nice and flat. And I'll just get rid of some of the seam allowance on the bottom edge as well. Now it is easier if you sew it lining side up, because then you can see your magnetic snaps and they won't get caught on your machine bed. So I would just recommend that. Now we're going to turn this right sides out. This is where you're going to start to see the wax canvas develop some of its marks. And I have got this turning tool that I'm going to use to poke those edges out. Okay, once that's turned out, what we're going to do is top stitch this edge with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. But again, we're not stitching this top. We're going to leave that open for now. Once that's top stitched, we're going to fit it to our exterior main panel. So this is the one that we've marked already. Now on the lining side, I have marked the center of my flap, and I'm going to match that up with the center mark just here and make sure that it's sitting straight on that line. Now what we want to do is sew this in place with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then with a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance, if you can manage it, just to reinforce it. This is going to be a little bit difficult as it's going to want to sort of move around a bit. If you have sew tights, which are like these sewing magnets, you can use them to hold this in place. They're brilliant, but unfortunately I don't have any. So instead, I'm going to use some jumbo clips to take this over to the sewing machine. And then I'll have to move these out of the way as I'm sewing. Now, the reason that we drew the line is so that you can keep an eye on it as you're sewing, and that way, if you're kind of going off track, you should be able to tell. You can try to use a little bit of glue or double-sided tape to stick this down, but we're sewing this with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So anything that you use, you don't want it to be visible once we pull the flap down, because this flap is going to fold down once we're finished. That's your flap sewn on. Now at this point you might start panicking, it's going to cause a crease. It's not. What we're going to do with this flap is we're going to fold it like this, so we get a nice curved edge. It gives it kind of like character on the front of the bag. And then you'll see you don't get any creases. But this is the reason that in the pattern I don't recommend using like really, really heavy materials, because it's going to be harder to create this nice little fold. Now for me, I'm just going to put a couple of heavy books on that and let it sit for a little while. But you can see here that we just created that fold a little bit further up. Okay, the next step is going to be to fit the magnetic snaps to the cargo pocket. Now, I really recommend just checking your measurements. So just measure between the centers of these and just check that that matches the marks you're making, because then you know that your magnetic snaps are going to fit perfectly. So I've already marked mine, and now I'm going to go ahead and fit the magnetic snaps. So we're fitting both of the female parts to this pocket. And make sure that you're using the exterior. So I've made this mistake before. This time we're attaching the magnetic snaps to the exterior pocket piece, not the lining. So when you're doing the flap, it's the lining. When you're doing the pocket piece, it's the exterior. Okay, so just like we did with the flap, we are going to mark both of these pieces up from the bottom. So we're just going to mark it 3/4 of an inch up from the bottom edge, and this is on the wrong side of the fabric, so the side that's got the back of your snaps and the wrong side of the bottom of your lining piece. Now I'm going to fold this up to the wrong side again so that it meets this line. So we're doing the exact same thing that we did with the flap. Okay, so you want to place these two pieces right sides together, and we're going to clip them around all 4 edges. Okay, now we're going to sew the sides and the top edge with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. But again, we're not sewing the folded edge yet. Okay, so I'm just going to snip these corners. That will make it easier to get like a nice neat finish. I generally find that doing these 2 snips will give me the best finish on a corner. And then we're going to turn this right sides out. Now I'm going to crinkle up my wax canvas as I go, because I want to get a bit more of a distressed look going on this pocket. And just like I did with the flap, I'm going to spend some time just persuading these seams to roll out, and particularly getting a nice finish on these corners. Okay, so that is my pocket finally turned out, and I like to give these edges like a little roll. I just find that kind of helps them sit a little bit better. If you want to, you can put some clips on. So these 2 bottom edges should still be folded in, and now we're just going to top stitch this top edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're using a 1/4 because later on we're going to use 1/8 of an inch to top stitch it again. When you're top stitching that, you might want to use a zipper foot, or like I had to, you can just move your needle over, because these magnetic snaps are going to get in the way. Now once that's done, you need to mark the exterior panel. Now you can see I've already marked mine using an awl. We're going to fold on these lines, so they're not really going to be visible, so I'm quite happy having those lines on my wax canvas, but if you prefer not to, you can just mark the top and the bottom and use those. Now what we're going to do is, working from this first line, we're going to fold this right sides together on the line. Now this bottom edge is still open, so just make sure that's still sitting quite neat. Now when you're doing this, you just want to make sure that it's all sitting straight, that these are straight, everything's just, otherwise your pocket's going to end up really wonky. I'm going to do the same with the first line on this side as well. So this is the outside line. You're going to fold the exterior right sides together, make sure that this is lining up nice and neat. Okay, and we're going to top stitch these edges with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure that you backstitch well at the top and the bottom. Now we've stitched those, we want to fold it with the lining right sides together on the second line. So you can see that line just there. I'm going to clip that at the top and the bottom. And then just give it a little press. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so we're going to top stitch these with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're going to pull it away. So we're just top stitching through this fold and you're not going through this. But before you do that, just kind of check that your pocket is nice and square, because sometimes you can end up with it being a little bit wonky. So you just want to do your best to make sure that it's all sitting square, that you haven't got anything sticking out anywhere. And I'll take that over and we're going to top stitch it with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that's easier to sew lining side up, but watch out, because if your magnetic snaps get caught on your machine bed, it can really make your stitching nice and wonky. So now that we are done there, I am going to clip this together and we're going to do a top stitch across here, which is going to set these pleats. So I'm going to use my hump jumper to get over here as I sew this. And if you're wondering why I'm not going to fix this first, that is because wax canvas is not a forgiving fabric, and if I fix that, I'm going to end up with holes on the show, so I'm not going to do that. Now I'm just going to top stitch this with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so that is my top stitched pocket. Now I'm going to fit this to the main panel, but first I'm going to crease up my main panel a bit because it's looking a bit too perfect. Okay, much better. Now to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put my pocket on and I'm going to close the magnetic snaps. I'm going to check that I'm happy with the fold that I've got, and then I'm just going to place the pocket right there. So I have got suggested measurements for where to put the pocket up from this edge. So the pattern does give a suggestion, but really I just like to fit it and then decide. So I think this is the best way to make sure your magnetic snaps fit nice and neat. Now, once you're happy with where it is, you just want to kind of fix this in place. Now, my pocket is flaring out a tiny bit at the bottom, so I haven't paid enough attention to my pleats, but I actually kind of like it. And I don't think it's going to be very noticeable, so I'm going to leave that as it is. I'm going to fold this over and clip into place. Now this is where, if you have those sew tight magnets, it's going to be a much easier step. Now, before I go anywhere, I'm just going to check that this is level with this. So I'm going to get my quilting ruler and just check the measurement on that. Okay, I'm happy that the bottom of this pocket is running parallel. The top of the flap is running parallel. Everything looks straight. So I'm going to take this over to the machine. I'm going to sew the side of the pocket, then across the bottom and then up the side. And that's when we're going to close up this bottom edge. Now, I'm going to make sure that I sort of hold this in place as I'm doing it. But what you can do is you can draw on the main panel where you want your pocket to go. That way, as an example, I could mark the bottom of this pocket, and then that way, if there is any movement when it's on the sewing machine, I'll be able to tell, and I'll know that I need to stop and readjust. Okay, so before you actually start sewing, you're going to have to unclip the top flap, and then as you're sewing, make sure that you backstitch really well at the beginning and end. And each time you need to readjust, make sure you leave your needle in as you adjust it, And just take your time with this because you really don't want to have a wonky front pocket. So just take your time and slowly unclip it as you're going. Okay, so that is our finished front panel. So what I'm going to do is set this aside, and I'm going to put a couple of books on it to make sure that this fold sets nice and neat. So as this bag is going to be used by my very active nephew, I'm going to add a couple of rivets that I just think will give this pocket even more reinforcement and should also just look quite nice. So I'm going to make my holes just between these threads. So I don't want to hit the threads because then they will break. Now these rivets are completely optional. They're not listed in the pattern. You don't have to do this. This is just something that I decided I want to do on this bag. Step 5 is the optional exterior zip pocket. So for this step, you're going to need your zip pocket facing, your zip, 2 pocket pieces and 1 exterior panel. Now for your pocket pieces, I have done mine in different fabrics just to try and make it really clear, because if you have a directional fabric, you need to make sure that you cut it, because one pocket is going to be, you know, this way up, the other pocket is going to be that way up. So you're just going to need to bear that in mind. So this print is going that way. It's not going to work for this pocket. You want the print that is going to be this tall, like taller than it is wide. That's the one that you want for this pocket. So I've already marked up my facing, so the pattern tells you how to do that. I've also marked this panel just here where I want to fit my facing. So now what I'm going to do is line up this bottom edge just here with the mark that I've made. I'm going to make sure that it's nice and straight, parallel to this, that it's not kind of wonky. So you might want to use a quilting ruler to make sure you get that right. And then I'm just going to pin that into place down the center, because this center is going to be cut out. So we can go ahead and we can use pins, and it doesn't matter that it's going to leave holes. Once that's pinned into place, we want to sew around this box. Now, as you get to these corners, just reduce your stitch length, maybe to about a 2. The shorter stitch length around these corners will end up giving you a neater finish on this. And make sure that your fabrics are right sides together. So this is the right side of the lining together with the right side of the exterior. Okay, so once that's sewn, we need to cut down this center line and the triangles. So I'm going to use a craft knife. I find that easiest to get really close. So you want to get as close as you can to those corners, but you do not want to cut your stitching. Now you can see that's all cut. So what we need to do is we need to push this through to the other side. So to get a neat finish, I'm going to press this with my seam roller. And I'm going to do this on all 4 sides. And then you just need to pull it through to the back. So just start with one edge at a time, and you're trying to get like a really neat edge here. So I just work my way through it one at a time. You kind of want to roll it out and press it. Now, if you want to, you could use double-sided tape or something here. I'm going to use glue because my double-sided tape does not work on this wax canvas. And what I'm going to do is just run a little bit of glue on all 4 sides. And then I'm going to push this back and press it down. Now I'll sit something on top of that to weigh it down for a minute. But this is what it's going to look like from the exterior. So set that aside and grab your 2 pocket pieces and your zip. Now I'm just going to pop my zip on here, so I just feed it in one end at a time. Got a rather large zip pull on this one. Okay, once you've got that on, you just push down and pull it on. Now you want to place your zip pocket pieces so that they are facing up. So if you have a directional print right now, this should be the top of your print, should be facing upwards. And you want to grab your zip and it needs to be closing toward the top. Place that on the right hand side and just clip those in place. Now you need to sew this zip with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so for the second pocket piece, if you have a directional print, it should be facing down right now. So you want it to be facing downward. Let's imagine that this is the top, so it'd be facing down. And you want to place the zip on top of it. And just match up the side and clip them together. Okay, now I'm going to sew this side with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so open that up and you should now have the right side of the zip with the wrong side of the fabric. And what we want to do is press these edges down to get like a nice flat finish so that this sits flat. Now with waterproof canvas, this is going to be a little bit tough. So what we're going to do is we're going to push that down and top stitch along the edges with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So it's going to be a lot easier to work with now it's laying flat. Now you're going to need your exterior main piece again, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a bit of double-sided tape along the long edges of the zip. So to make this easier to fit, I'm just going to do one side at a time. So I'll just start with this side. Now what we want is we want for this to be inside the box. Make sure that your zip is closing upward, and you just want to position it so the zip is nice and centered. Okay, once you're happy with that side, just move your zip pull in and remove this other side of double-sided tape. So take your time with this, make sure it's nice and centered before you stick it down. You can always lift it up and reset it. Now I'm happy with that, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance around the entire box. Make sure that your pocket pieces are open. So this one's over here and this one's over here. Otherwise you'll just stitch your pocket closed and you won't be able to use it. So I'm going to take that over. I'm going to start from about here and go all the way around. Okay, I'm really happy with how that's turned out. My nephew chose this very bright rainbow zip to go with his wax canvas. I was dubious, but actually it's looking quite cool. So we're going to flip that over, and you want to push it so that both the pocket pieces are like, you know, behind the main panel this way. One of them is significantly longer than the other. So we're just going to mark that. And then I'm just going to trim that to match. Now I'm going to clip these 3 sides together. Now we need to sew these 3 sides of the pocket closed, and to do that I'm going to pull the main panel away from it and then sew the pocket. And that is your pocket all finished. So got quite a spacious pocket in there. Now I'm just going to scrunch my panel up because it doesn't have enough character for my liking. And then we're going to set this aside and move on to the next step. Okay, step 6 is the optional interior zip pocket. So you're going to start to see how quick this bag would be to make if you weren't doing any pockets. But we're doing them all in this one. So you should have your 2 pocket pieces, your pocket facing, your main interior panel, and a zip. Okay, so I've already marked my main panel as directed in the pattern, and I've marked this. Now I'm just going to mark the center as well. Let's give that a little press, there we go. And what we want to do is line that up underneath the line that you've drawn and make sure the centers are matched. Now I'm going to stick it in place with a bit of double-sided tape. So what you want to do with your double-sided tape is just make sure it's completely centered, just a little bit of it, because if it's completely centered it will be inside that box. Okay, so we're placing this right sides together, match up those center marks, make sure that your pocket is nice and straight, so you want to make sure that it's an even gap on each side, that it's running completely straight. And then the same as the exterior, we're going to stitch this box here. I'm going to use a shorter stitch length on the corners, and I'm going to start sort of midway. Don't start on a corner. You'll find if you start on a corner it's really hard to finish neatly on a corner, so if you start on one of the straight edges it's much easier to come back round. Okay, so grab a craft knife again, and we're going to cut this one just like we did with the exterior zip pocket. So you just want to cut down that center line, and then you want to get as close as you can to these stitches, but do not cut the stitches. Now what we want to do is press all 4 sides, try and get a neater finish. Now ordinarily I would use an iron if I was using all cotton, but with the waterproof canvas I do not want to use an iron. I know some people do, but I like to be cautious. So you're going to pull that facing through to the back and roll 1 seam at a time. You just want to get a nice neat finish on this seam. Now I'm going to use some double-sided tape to hold this down. So flip that over and just check that you've got a nice neat box. And I will just use a tiny bit of heat later to remove that, probably just use a hairdryer on it. So set that aside and grab your 2 zip pocket pieces and your zip. Now you can see here that I've got a directional print, so the mountains need to be pointing upwards. So I'm just going to grab this one to start with. I'm going to place my zip on top with the zip closing to the left and clip those together. And we'll take that over and sew it with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now grab your second zip pocket piece. Make sure again that this is facing upwards, so this is the top of my mountains. And you're going to put the zip right side up on top. Line that up and clip it into place. And we're going to sew that with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so your zip should now be the right side showing on the wrong side of the fabric. And you can give this a press with the iron to make that lay flat if you're using cotton, or you can just top stitch both edges with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is what I'm going to do now. Now that's laying flat, grab your lining piece from earlier And what you want to do is place that centered over the zip. And what we're going to do is sew this into place. So to keep everything in place, I'm going to use some double-sided tape again. And I'm going to do one side at a time. So I'll peel the top off first. And I'll try and get that nicely centered. Just try and make sure that that seam doesn't kind of unroll on you. And stick that in place. And then make sure that your zipper pull is inside and take the double-sided tape off the bottom edge. Okay, once that's all looking good, we're going to stitch with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around this box. When you need to move your zip pull, make sure that you leave your needle in and then lift the presser foot up to move the zip pull away. I like to use a matching thread here because I really like to back stitch. Now, if you don't want to back stitch, you can always pull the threads through and tie them off at the back, but I feel like a back stitch is much more secure. When you're sewing that, just make sure that your pocket is open. So this one should be showing up here and that one down there. So they're completely open. Otherwise you'll sew your pocket closed. Now flip this over and pull this top one down. Now you'll notice that it doesn't match, which is fine. And what we're going to do is we're going to trim this other one so that it does match. As you can tell from mine, it does not need to be perfect. It's going to be hidden. No one's ever going to see it. So what we're going to do is clip it on all 3 sides. Okay, then we're going to sew these edges of the pocket closed. And what we're going to do is pull the main panel away from it as we sew it. Okay, so that is your zip pocket all finished. You can set that aside and move on to the next step. Step 7 is the straps. For this step, you're going to need your strap anchor and the stabilizer for it, your 2 grab handle pieces and the stabilizer, your 2 lower straps and your 2 top straps. Now, if you're using webbing, then you can skip this first step. So the first thing we're going to do is mark the center on our long and short straps. So you can see I've already marked the center on mine. Now I need to fold these long edges into the center. So what I'm going to do is use double-sided tape down both of these long edges. So we're just going to fold these long edges into the center line. And what I'm going to do, because I'm using waterproof canvas, I'm going to use a seam roller to get a nice neat finish on those edges. Do the same with the other long edge so that they both meet on the center line. And if you want, you can just leave a tiny gap down the center. If you're using a thick material like this, that just helps it to lay slightly better. Once that's done, you want to fold it again on the original center line and just clip that together. So there's an extra pointer in the pattern. If you want to have some padding inside your straps, you can just cut some foam strips out of like whatever leftovers you've got. You can zigzag stitch them together and you can shove them in between these layers before you clip this. And what it does is just gives you a nice spongy strap. Now I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to top stitch with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to top stitch again with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I don't recommend going any bigger because what will happen is your rivets will go through your threads later on. So an 1/8 of an inch and a 1/4 of an inch just gives a really nice finish, gives a bit of extra stability to the strap, and your rivets shouldn't go through it later. So that's your finished top strap. Then you just need to repeat the process to create the other one and the 2 lower straps. Now set those aside and we'll move on to the grab handle. So you should have 2 exterior pieces and a stabilizer. Now I'm making my grab handle out of the waterproof canvas. You can choose to do that if you want to, or you can make it out of your wax canvas. I just didn't have enough wax canvas left, so this is what I've chosen to use. Now we're going to call these legs like long legs, short legs, because I don't know what else to call them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the seam allowance on the short legs. So I'm just going to mark it on there using an awl. And because I'm using waterproof canvas, this is pretty easy to do. So for the curve, you're going to kind of have to spend a little bit longer just working your way around the curve. Okay, so now that's marked out, I'm going to snip into this curve because I want it to lay flat later on. But my seam allowance is only going to be 1/4 inch, so my snips need to be less than 1/4 inch. Now, I'm using this, I think it's called a pattern notcher. Adam got this for me for just this sort of occasion. So it just kind of chops out a little semicircle almost. But you can just snip into this with scissors, it will work just as well. Okay, so I'm going to fold the curve down first. So I've put some fabric glue in here and I'm going to fold the curved edge first. Now this is probably going to end up with me with fabric glue everywhere. Okay, so now that the curve is folded, I'm now going to fold these straight edges down. Okay, so this is a little bit of a faffy step, but compared with sewing it and then turning it out through a small turning gap, which just was impossible, and you know, other options, this ended up being the option that I found gave the best finish, like gave the neatest finish and didn't hurt my hands from turning it out. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to top stitch up here along the curve and down this straight edge with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to repeat the whole process with this second one. Once those are both top stitched, you're going to place them right sides together. And the important bit is to match up these folded edges because that will give it a nice neat finish. So if you match those first and clip them together, then you can clip the rest of the grab handle together. Okay, so we're going to sew these long legs with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to sew the sides and then we're going to sew the curve, but you don't need to sew these bottom edges. So on this bottom curve, I'm going to do the same thing and just snip into the seam allowance. This will help it to lay flat on the curve. Now you can just use a small pair of scissors and snip into it if you want. Now we're going to turn this right sides out. Okay, so you want to have a neat curve, but don't worry too much about these long legs because they're going to be hidden shortly. So grab your stabilizer. You should be able to see that it's got a specific way round and you want to slip that inside. This is going to be a nice snug fit. You might need to trim it down just a little bit if you have trouble getting it in there. Okay, once your foam is in, you need to grab your 2 top straps. And what we're going to do is we're going to slip these in. So you can go above or below the foam, it really doesn't matter. But what we're going to do is slip it in as far as it will go. So it'll end up stopping just down here. And you want it to be up against this edge here. And then just clip that in place. Okay, we're going to do the same thing with the other one. Okay, now we're going to top stitch the entire grab handle with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to do another stitch across here at about 3/8 of an inch. And then if you want to, you can fit a rivet on each strap just to really reinforce it. Okay, so that's the grab handle finished. Now I do recommend using a matching thread for this step because as you can see there's just a lot of fussy stitching going on here and it just kind of hides any errors that you might make as you're going. I did do an extra seam just here just to really enforce those straps, and I've added my rivets too. So set that aside and grab your strap anchor and the foam stabilizer. Now I've already marked the centers on each, so I'm just going to lay this down the center. It should be inset on each short edge as well. And then I'm just going to wrap this around. Now we're going to top stitch this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance down these long edges, and then I'll just baste the sides closed whilst I'm doing it. Right, set that aside just for a moment and grab your back panel. And you're also going to need your grab handle. Now I've marked the top of my back panel as indicated in the pattern. And what I'm going to do is lay this on top of that line. Now I want to make sure that it's inset by equal amounts on both sides. So I've marked mine up ready for that. You can also mark the center here and make sure that that's matching. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew a box here on the bottom of each of these legs, and that is going to secure it in place until we put the strap anchor on top. Now because this isn't going to be seen later, I'm going to do this by means of a pin on each leg. Now that I've sewn those on, I've marked a second line. So in the pattern it tells you how much further down we want this to go, so you can mark a second line if you want to, if you think it helps with guiding it. And then I'm just going to put that on there and clip that into place. Now the foam will be kind of pulling this strap anchor in, so even though we cut it the exact same width as the panel, you're going to kind of have to push it down and stretch it to get it to fit, because the foam inside just kind of makes it want to contract a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to sew this down with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on both long edges and then a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so if your strap anchor is pulled in just a touch from the side like this, don't worry about it. That's what seam allowances are for. When you're doing this, watch out for your straps. You do not want to sew through your straps if one of them's hanging down the back. And also just watch out for your pocket, just in case, you know, it's a bit skew-if and it's getting up there. If your grab handle has like different fabrics on different sides, just be aware when you're fitting it that this is going to be the side that's touching your shoulders. So this is going to be like the hidden side. And then when the backpack is worn, this bit is going to be on show. So if you have a right side up to your grab handle, then this is the bit that you want to have on show. So that is your back panel done. So set that aside and we'll move on to the next step. Step 8 is the base. For this step, you're going to need your 2 lower straps, your 2 side exterior pieces, so they should be reversed like this, opposites, and your base piece. Now the first thing you want to do is mark the centers on your base piece and mark the 2 sides as indicated in the pattern. So what we're going to do is we're going to attach these lower straps. Now I like to do this on my grid mat. It just helps me to make sure that I've got it all nice and straight. So what I do is I put it on like that. So what you want is you want this edge here to be on a straight line. And then we're just going to make sure that this is overhanging by 1 inch. So this is really easy if you've got a grid mat because you can just make sure it's hanging over by the correct amount. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. So you're making sure that the majority of the strap is pointing toward this long edge of the base, not the short. And we're just going to baste those into place. Once those are attached, grab your 2 exterior sides and you just want to mark the seam allowance on each of them on this slanted edge. So you can see I've already done mine. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to place them right side up next to the base, which is right side up. So I'm going to match up the sides so I know which one goes on which side. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold these over so they're right sides together. Now the reason we marked the seam allowance is because when you're sewing a slant like this, you'll end up with like a big wobble in your fabric if you don't line it up correctly. So what we're going to do, you can see there's like a big bit hanging over here because this seam allowance mark is lined up with the edge of the base. And down here, it's the same thing. It's lined up with the edge of the base. That's how it needs to be. So we're just going to clip that into place. Now, before you go any further, just check that as you fold that back, that's going to be correct. And you know you're definitely using the correct side on the correct side of the base. So I'm going to clip the other side into place exactly the same, lining up that seam allowance mark with the edge of the base, and then I'm going to sew both of those into place. Okay, so now when we push this back, this should all line up pretty nicely. Okay, so you can see, you know, it's pretty perfect on these edges. If you do fit yours wrong and you kind of end up, you know, with this piece being higher than this piece, it's not the end of the world. You can trim your gusset and then later on you'd have to just trim your lining gusset to match. So it's not a massive problem, but you know, by doing it this way, we can just get it right first time. So I'm just going to trim this tiny little triangle off here. And then I'm going to top stitch this. But what we need to do, and this is very important, is make sure that this is pointing up toward the exterior sides. So that means that your seams are going to be going behind the base, not behind the side piece. Okay, so that's very important that it's pointing up away from the base. And then what we're going to do is we're going to top stitch the base here with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to do the exact same thing on this side. Again, making sure that the strap is pointing upwards toward the exterior side. Okay, so you can see this side lines up perfectly. This side lines up down here, but not up here. So this is probably an issue with my cutting more than anything. So I'm just going to trim that down so that it doesn't cause a problem later on. Okay, so these straps, they are going to take a lot of weight. You know, this is a full-size backpack, especially if it's being used by a teenager or someone like that. It's going to take a lot of weight, you know, a lot of binders, laptops, that sort of thing. So what we're going to do is an extra bit of stitching to hold this in place here. So I'm just going to trace around the strap. I find this easier to do using a ruler. So I just push the ruler up against the strap. I'm making sure that it's kind of straight with the strap. And I'm just going to use, this is an erasable fabric pen. So make sure you're using an erasable fabric pen or chalk or something like that. Whatever you're using, check it on and off cut before you draw on your base like this. You do not want to ruin it. Okay, because we're not actually sewing over this line, we're just marking the edges and then we're going to sew 1/8 of an inch in. So I'm going to mark the other side exactly the same. And then what we're going to do is sew 1/8 of an inch from this top stitching down here to create a box. But before I do that, I'm going to add some extra reinforcement behind. So this is an optional step. If you're using like a thin fabric, I would strongly recommend doing this. But again, this bag is going to take a lot of weight. So what I'm going to do, I've got a piece of Peltex. You could use any stabilizer you've got. Absolutely anything at all. We're just reinforcing the straps. And I'm just going to put that under there. So when we sew through this and when we rivet through it, it's just going to have another extra layer for it to hold on to. So I'm going to do the exact same thing to the other side. And then we're going to sew this in place with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance inside the box that we've drawn. I recommend using a matching thread for this. You can see I am using a contrasting thread for the purpose of this video, so it's nice and clear. But it is a bit of fussy stitching and you may prefer to use a matching thread because these are going to be like angles on a slant. You might want them to be sort of more blending into your fabric and hidden. So you're now going to want to remove that pen mark. If you have a heat erasable pen like mine, I do not recommend getting your iron near this because I've just had my iron nearby my wax canvas before and it blew some steam out and just changed it all to a white colour. So just be really, really cautious with your iron around this. So I think what I'm going to do is use a hairdryer, or alternatively I'm going to use my iron but make sure the steam is off, and I'm also going to completely cover the wax canvas and just stay away from it. So just be aware of that. But what I'm going to do first is fit a couple of rivets. So I've got this handy little rivet template, so I will link this in the video description. And I'm going to line that up and fit a couple of rivets right in the middle of this box. And this is where that extra layer of stabilizer underneath this strap is just really going to help. So I'll take that over to the press and press those in place, and I'll do the same on this side. So that's your finished base. Now, if you're not using rivets, I would definitely recommend sewing an X through this box for extra reinforcement. Now, what I'm going to do is just check the width of this compared to my top gusset. Now, just due to cutting and seam allowances used and various different things, you may end up with slightly different sizes. So you can see I have done with mine. I think that's because I used slightly smaller seam allowance on this zip. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim this top gusset down to match. And then if you have to trim this because you've got wonkiness for these joins, if your base has got wonkiness on the joins, then remember to trim your lining gusset to match. So all of these are trimmable. It's not going to be a problem at all. What's important is that they all match before we construct the bag. Okay, step 9 is your bottle pocket. So this is another optional pocket. You should have your lining gusset bottom, your mesh pocket piece, a piece of fold over elastic, and a piece of binding, or you can use a piece of waterproof canvas for the bottom. Now the first thing you need to do is mark one side of your lining gusset. So this is on the right side of the fabric. Mine's already marked up and ready to go. Now grab your pocket piece. Now this should be a two-way stretch mesh. So mine stretches that way. And that's what you want. You want it to stretch widthways. So mark the top at the center, which is a little bit tricky, but you can see I've just done mine. And then you also want to mark your fold over elastic on the center. Now the first thing we're going to do is attach the centers together. So I'm going to use just a little bit of glue for this. And that should just help it to stay in place. Now match up these center marks, and then you just want to fold over your elastic and clip it in place. Okay, then I'm going to put a little bit more glue along this fold over elastic on the inside. Okay, now the next step is going to be way easier if you've got 4 hands. So what we have to do is we have to attach the end here of the fold over elastic to the end of the pocket. So you do that first of all. But then we need to stretch the rest of the pocket and clip it in place. So this is going to be a lot easier with 4 hands. If there's somebody you can borrow their hands for a bit, just go for it. So Adam has come in here to join me quickly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch the elastic and push that mesh into it. And then Adam, can you just clip that in place? So this is really hard to hold and clip at the same time because you need to stretch the fold over elastic and you need to stretch the pocket as well. Go ahead, loads of clips. The more the merrier. Okay, and then we're going to do the same thing on this side. So you don't want it bunching up. You want to make sure that the mesh is right up inside that fold. Okay, so we now need to top stitch this in place. As you're top stitching it, you do need to stretch it to make sure that the mesh isn't bunching up. I strongly recommend that you top stitch this edge first because we're going to do the bottom edge and the top edge. But if you do the bottom edge first, that will make sure that you catch it if any of your mesh is kind of slipping down a little bit. And then we'll top stitch the top edge. Okay, so that's not the easiest step, but that's done. Now, because I'm using waterproof canvas for the bottom instead of binding, I'm just going to fold this down the center and roll the seam. And then I've already marked my centers. And what I'm going to do is just put a little bit of glue again down this center line. That should just help hold it in place. So this bottom edge is not going to be stretchy. Now I'm just going to clip that center in place first. Then I'm going to bring the edges in and clip those. Now for these sections, I'm just going to fold it. So you can fold it whichever way you like. I'm going to fold this toward the outside of the pocket. So you're just taking the excess and just folding it in. Whichever way you fold it on one side, make sure that you do the same on the other. It might look a little bit odd. Not that anybody's ever going to notice the bottom of this pocket, but there we go. Okay, so you can see I've got like a pleat on each side. I've just done those by sight. I've not measured them. They look about even. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch again along each long edge. Okay, forget what I just said. We're only top stitching the top edge because we're going to stitch the bottom edge in just a moment. Now, as you're doing this, having an awl on hand is really helpful because you can make sure that you can push the mesh back in if it slips out of the binding. So I definitely recommend having one of those on hand. Okay, so now that your pocket is prepared, grab your lining gusset. Now you marked it earlier, just down from one of the short edges. So line up this top edge of the pocket with that mark. And you're just going to clip this side in place. Okay, now we're going to baste that side. Once that side is basted, you want to match up the other side. So again, match up the top of the pocket with the line that you drew. And then clip this in place. Now we're going to sew down this side, and then we're going to sew across the bottom as well. So that's your pocket complete. Now all we need to do is remove that line, and then we can move on to the next step. Let's get started on step 10, the completed gusset. So you're going to need your top exterior gusset, your base exterior gusset, your gusset stabilizer, and your lining bottom gusset. So we'll set those two aside for now. And what we want to do is put these right sides together. So this is the exterior side of the zip gusset, and we're going to place it right sides together with the exterior base. You can do this on either end and just clip those together. And we're just going to baste that together on this short edge. Now the exteriors are sewn together, we want to grab the lining gusset, and we're going to place this right sides together with the lining side of this zip gusset. Now you could attach either end, it really doesn't matter, because it's just going to make a difference as to which side your bottle pocket is on, and unless you have a preference about which side your bottle pocket goes on, it's not going to matter. So we're going to sew through all these layers just along this short edge. Okay, so now that's sewn, we're just going to push the lining and the exterior away from the seam. So just give it a little press with your fingers, or you could use a seam roller. And I'm just going to make sure that my gussets are lined up and then clip them together. And we're going to top stitch through here with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so once that one's top stitched, we are going to attach the other side of the gusset. So the other side of the exterior base, you want to bring the zip gusset over to meet it. Its exteriors right sides together, and then clip them in place. Now we're going to baste this and then attach the lining. If you prefer to, you can do both at once. So what we would do is baste this and then attach the lining so that it's right sides together. So make sure your lining is right sides together with the lining on the zip gusset. So I'm going to do that this one time and show you. So you don't necessarily need to baste if you don't want to. You can just sew them both at the same time. So I'm going to sew through this short edge with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now a lot of people like to trim their zips off when they're finished. Personally, I like to leave it in there. I just feel like it adds strength to the seam. With straps in the past, I've had problems when, you know, you trim them right back to the seam. They're not as strong. So I feel that surely the same applies to zips, but that's personal choice. If you want to trim your zip back, you can of course do that. So we're going to do the same thing on this side. We're going to pull the lining and exterior away from the seam. So I'm just going to give it a little press to get a neat finish. In order to do this, you're going to need to turn your gusset out. So I will just clip those together so that they stay straight. And then I'm going to top stitch this seam with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so once that's all done, we need to add our stabilizer. So we don't want to use heat with waterproof canvas and wax canvas, so I'm not going to fuse it on. So instead what I'm going to do is baste one of these long edges closed and then slip it in. So there we go, got it so that the exterior is on the outside, and I'm just going to clip this long edge so that the lining and the exterior base gussets are together. Now I'm just going to baste this edge closed. So now that one side is closed, we can put our stabilizer in. But first of all, I'm just going to kind of crease this up a bit because this wax canvas is looking a little bit too perfect. This will be harder to do once I've got my stabilizer in it. Okay, so you need to stick your stabilizer in through the open side. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is a little bit awkward. And you need to make sure that it's going right up to the edges, so really snug in those corners. Now, you can put some clips along here to sort of hold it in place once it's up against this edge. Now, this is a really tight fit, so if you're finding that you just can't squeeze this in, then what you can do is you can just trim 1/2 inch off. So just like that, and then it will be an easier fit. Once you've got that in there, all the way in, we're just going to clip this side together and then baste it with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. As you're sewing that, be careful that you avoid your lower straps. You do not want to sew through those. Also, when you're basting where the bottle pocket is, you kind of want to make sure the mesh is kept out of the way, because if it's sort of folded over like this, you could end up basting through it. So just be careful of that. Okay, so that's our gusset completed. What we're going to do now is just mark all of the centers because it will make fitting the panels a lot easier. So you're just going to match up your side panels and then mark the centers on the exterior and the lining. Once you've done that on the top and bottom, you want to bring your top and bottom center marks together like this, and this will allow you to then mark the centers on the sides as well. Once all of your centers are marked, we can move on to the final step, final construction. So this is where we're going to bring the whole bag together. Now we're just going to start off with the laptop strap panel and the exterior back panel. Now this is a good point to kind of get your straps out of the way. So you can see I've already rolled this one up. Now before I roll this one up, I just want to show you one idea from some of the testers, and that was to cover this raw edge. So this will sort of be folded underneath and pretty much hidden from view later on. But if you want this to be completely hidden, some of my testers, they just cut out this 1 inch by 1.5 inch piece of cork, and then they just wrap it around there and sew that into place to just give it a nice little finish. So if you want to do that, now is definitely the time to do it. Okay, so I've added my little end. Now I'm just going to roll that out the way because we don't want to sew through the straps by accident. All of your panels, lining and exterior, should be marked on the centers, on the long edges and on the short edges. So I've already done mine, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to place these wrong sides together and I'm going to line up those marks. Now, especially with this panel, you do want to line up the marks because you'll find that the back pocket will kind of stretch the exterior panel a little bit out of shape, and you want to make sure that you are actually lining it up correctly. Okay, so you can see that my lining piece is a tiny bit too big. I've checked it against the pattern piece and it is just too big. I've just cut it too big. So that's fine. I've made sure that it's nice and centered and I've clipped everything together. I can trim that later on. What we're going to do now is we're going to baste the lining and exterior together, and we're going to start from the top of the strap anchor, come all the way down and finish at the top of the strap anchor. So you're leaving this top edge unsewn. Okay, so watch out that your laptop strap doesn't get caught on the machine bed. And also watch out that the exterior panel is going to kind of try to pull itself in as you're sewing it because of all this extra stuff on the bottom. Now, if like me, your lining panel is a little bit too big, you can just trim it now to match. Okay, now grab your stabilizer and we're going to unclip the top and slip this in. You can kind of fold it a little bit if you need to. Once that's inside, we're going to clip the top together. Now we're just going to baste that top edge. Watch out again for your straps. Watch out for your laptop strap getting caught on the machine. And you're just going to close that to hold the stabilizer in. Okay, so that's your back panel ready. Just set that aside. Now for the front panel, we're not going to have a stabilizer because the body of the WPC should be good enough. If you are using like cotton for your lining or a thin WPC, then you probably are going to want to add something. But for this, if you're using the materials suggested in the pattern, you definitely don't need any stabilizer. What we're going to do is we're going to put these wrong sides together again. So this is the front panel and the lining panel with the zip pocket. Match up those center marks and clip those together first. Now we're going to baste the whole panel with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now you might think that this seems like a good opportunity to fit your strap sliders, and it is, but we're going to wait until the end just because different strap sliders and different strap materials and different types of webbing will work differently, and we do not want these straps to be like slipping every time the bag's full. So we're going to wait till the end because then we can test it, see how easily the straps slide, and then we can fit the sliders with some extra padding if we need to. So what we want to do first of all is fit this gusset, and we're going to turn it lining side out. And we need to fit it so that these lower straps are pointing toward the back panel. So you can see that they're on that side. This is really important or else your straps aren't going to work and you're going to have to pull it all apart. So make sure that your straps are pointing toward the back panel. And the first thing we're going to do is match up the center marks, top, bottom, and on the sides, and then we'll clip the rest of the gusset into place. Once you've got those centers matched up, we need to get these curves matched. So you want to do your curves at the very end. So I'm just going to do the rest of this straight stretch. And then you'll see that your curve won't fit. So that's the way it should be. What you want to do is snip into the gusset, not the panel, just the gusset. And the reason that this needs to be slightly smaller is because we're sewing the seam allowance 3/8 of an inch in, and the circumference of the panel is much smaller, it's 3/8 of an inch in. So once I've snipped into that, then I can spread the gusset and it will fit. Okay, so where your bottle pocket is, just make sure that you've not got too much mesh caught there. Now I'm going to clip the rest of this panel into place. An alternative option for cutting it into these curves on the gusset is to use one of these pattern notches. So I know these are designed for something entirely different, but what they do is they create like a little curved cutout. Okay, so if you've made one of my bags before, you're going to notice this gusset is looser. I absolutely love tight gussets. They're really, really good for making sure that you don't get the puckers. So I like to do mine mathematically based on the circumference of the seam allowance. However, a lot of people don't like them. They're harder to fit, you know, you've got to snip in, you've got to really stretch it around the curve. So I have adjusted this one based on the fact that I realised people don't like tighter gussets. So this one is a little bit bigger, you will notice, which isn't my favourite thing, but there you go. Now, you'll also know what I'm going to suggest next if you've done one of my patterns before. I'm going to suggest that you hand baste these curves. Doesn't need to be neat, doesn't need to be like, you know, perfect in any way. So long as your stitches are hidden within the seam allowance, that is fine. What it's going to do is it's going to hold the curves in place so they won't slip when you're at the sewing machine, because this is a big bag and it's going to want to move around as you're going through the sewing machine. An alternative method a lot of people use is to staple the curves. Personally, I don't like stapling. You have to remove the staples afterwards. You also have to avoid them whilst you're sewing. For me, it ends up being more time consuming. Just throwing like a needle and thread through these curves, it's just much quicker in my opinion. But it's, you know, try both methods, see what you prefer, see what you get on with. So I'm going to hand baste these curves, just the curves, and then I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine. And we're going to sew it with a scant 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'm sewing it with a scant 3/8 because when we sew the binding on, we will be using a 3/8. And we don't want to go over the same pieces of stitching more than once. When you're sewing this, just make sure that you're not sewing through the stabilizer. So if necessary, you might just need to nudge it out of the way as you're sewing, because it's within those basting seams, so it could be a little bit less central than you want it. So just maneuver it out the way as you're sewing if you need to. So that's your gusset fitted. Now before you go any further, just pop all your corners out and just check that they're looking neat and that they're okay, that you haven't got any puckers or anything like that, because now's the time that you can fix them. So if you're happy with all of that, you can now fit your binding. Now, on this occasion, I'm going to use waterproof canvas instead of binding. So this is something that's been suggested to me by a lot of people. So I wanted to give it a go, and I mentioned it in the pattern, but I haven't used the bag long enough to check, you know, how this survives. But I've been told that it holds up really, really well and that it's no different to binding. So hopefully that is correct. What I'm going to do, I've just got a 1 inch wide piece of binding, well, WPC, and what I've done is I've folded it down the center and I've rolled it with my seam roller. So I'm literally just going to wrap that around the seam. And this is going to mean that we've got raw edges. But with WPC, that is not supposed to be a problem. So maybe ask me in a year once this bag has been worn to death by my nephew and we will know for sure. But I've been told by numerous people that this is absolutely brilliant and that it lasts just as long as real binding. So hopefully they are correct. So I'm just wrapping it around the whole seam. When I'm fitting binding, I do this the same way, whether it's binding or this WPC. I just wrap it around the entire seam in one go. I make sure it's nice and tight, and then I clip it. I find personally that this is the way that I get the neatest result. There's a lot of ways to fit binding. A lot of people sew one side on first and then wrap it around and sew the other. I find that my binding goes kind of wavy if I do that, so this is my preferred method. Now you just want to make sure that it's covering all the stitching, so you can't see the stitching on either side. Okay, so I've clipped it around the rest of the bag and I'm happy that my binding is covering all of my stitching. Now where I've reached the end, I'm just going to trim this down a bit and I'm going to fold this edge over. And I'm going to wrap that over the top of the first bit of binding. Okay, now I'm going to sew this on with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to change my thread for one that matches this binding. It makes a massive difference to how your binding looks. If you use like a black thread on this sort of grey fabric, it will not look as neat. So I do recommend changing out your thread if you have some matching for your fabric. So you'll want to change your needle out for something bigger. I use a size 110 or an 18 for this fit. Whatever materials you're using, you're going to need to use a needle that's suitable to those materials. I find an awl is really helpful for making sure that the binding stays in place as I'm sewing it. And I like to sew this with the panel side up and the gusset side down. This means that when we go around these curves, I can really get the angle correct, and it helps me to get a nice neat finish on the curves. Okay, so that is my binding attached. Now I've got a tiny bit just here where it just slipped away. I'm not worried about that. I'm not going to redo it for that. So I'm going to leave that as it is. I'm going to flip that over, and now it's time to fit the front panel. So grab your front panel, and we need to match up these center marks to the top and bottom and the sides of the gusset. Okay, so then we're going to fit these curves, and again I'm going to snip into the gusset to make them fit. Now you can either sew this with your zip closed or open, it's up to you. If your zip is closed, you can always open it afterwards just by grabbing the zips like that from the underneath, so don't worry about that. Now I'm going to hand baste my curves, then I'll take this over to the machine and sew it on with a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So if while you're sewing this on, you find that you start to sort of go off track a bit and go, into like say a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, don't worry about it too much. I find it easier to just carry on going. And then when I get to the end, if there's anywhere where I've come in too far into the seam, then I just redo that little section. There's nothing wrong really with having these little extra bits of sewing, and it's much easier than stopping and starting all the time. So now we're going to do the same as we did on the other side, and starting from the bottom, we're going to fit the binding. Okay, so my binding's all clipped on. Now I'm going to sew it on. Just take your time with this. If you need to, take a break, have a cup of tea, have a hot chocolate. This bit is not particularly easy, and it's a big bag, so you're kind of wrestling it all through the machine. It's a little bit tiring, so take a break if you need to, because sometimes that stops you from making mistakes. And don't be afraid to just kind of crush the bag and maneuver it as you need to get it through the machine and make it work for you. Okay, so we're there now. Now, I know that step is really hard, but that's the hardest part. And once you've done that, we're pretty much done. So what I would just say is just to check your corners. Okay, so here you can see I've not got a great corner going on there. So I'm going to redo that one. And if you pop each corner out, you can just turn your whole bag out. You can check that your seams are okay and that you've got a nice soft curve, and redo anything that you need to do. This is where I think having a matching thread with your binding is really important, because I can just redo this curve and you're not going to be able to see because the stitching is just going to blend into my binding. Okay, so I'm going to turn my bag right sides out. So your bag is pretty much done. Hopefully you are liking the look of it now. The wax canvas I just love because it gives it this really rustic feel, which is what we were going for on this bag, and also it's kind of a little bit more forgiving. So if you get like the tiniest little mistake, okay, I've got a little mistake just here where I caught this with my thread by accident. You're not going to notice it because of the rustic nature of this fabric. So I really, really like it for that. Now, we just need to fit the strap sliders. So yes, this would have been easier to do earlier, but there's a good reason that we didn't. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put the strap sliders through like this. So you're wrapping it over the center bar, and then you want the end to come back as close as you can get it to the side of the bag, because what we want is when you're wearing the backpack for it to be completely hidden. So I'm just going to clip that where it is. Okay, now before we rivet that in place, we're going to check the straps to see how they adjust, because if you're using a large slider and like slippery thin nylon webbing, you might have a problem. So before we do anything else, we're going to check. Now the problem is if you fit the slider earlier on, then you can't check this. Okay, so what we kind of want to do is just see whether it unslides easily. Okay, so this one is looking like it's okay, like the WPC is gripping nicely. Now if your strap is just pulling out easily, then when your bag is full and heavy, the straps are just going to gradually slide and lengthen themselves, and we don't want that. So what we're going to do, if your strap is sliding too easily, then you're going to grab a piece of Peltex or a piece of foam or anything like that, and you're just going to cut a small piece. So we'll just go for 1 inch by 1.5 inches. And what you want to do is thicken up your strap slider. So you just want to slip it in there between the fabric and the bar. And you want to do it nice and tight, so it's going to be hidden when this is secured. But what it means is it's going to thicken this up so that your strap won't slide so easily. Now another option you've got, if you prefer, is to fold the strap over twice. So this lower strap, what you could do, if you can finagle it enough, is you can pop it through another time. Now this is awkward. I did do it on a previous bag, but it is awkward, and you can get it so it goes twice around the bar. So those are a couple of options, but basically before you fit these sliders, you just want to check, you know, how your straps are fitting. You do not want them to be sliding later on. So on each of these sliders, we're going to mark for 4 rivets. So I'm going to use my strap rivet guide, and I'm going to do 2 near the end. And then I'll do 2 up by the slider. Okay, so I'm going to punch holes here and install my rivets, and I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Okay, so you can of course sew those on if you don't have rivets. Now what we're going to do is the last step, and we're going to feed the straps through. Make sure your straps are nice and straight. Now if you like really short straps, you could trim your strap down now. Now I know I've added my cork accents on already, but what I'm going to do is wait to check this out for size on my nephew and where he wants to have the bag sit on his back and how low, and then I'll trim, because what will happen is when you're wearing the bag, the leftover strap will sort of hang down like this. So if this bag is for you and you know exactly how high you want this to sit on your back, you could trim these down if you want to. So the last step, once you've measured your, and decided how big you want it, is to fold this over. Now, if you've got a cork end like me, you can just fold it over like that, rivet through it. All we're doing is trying to stop it from slipping back through the slider. If you don't have a cork end, I would do a triple fold. That way the raw edge is completely hidden, and then rivet through there with 2 rivets. And that's it, that's your bag done. So I'm really happy with how that turned out. I know it's a big bag, and I know, you know, it's a bit of investment time-wise, but it's just great to be able to make something for the guys in your life for a change. And yeah, it's just a really nice kind of rustic design. This one is going to my younger nephew, so he made the bold choice of going with rainbow hardware with rustic navy. I actually think it looks quite good, but my husband Adam is also going to make another one for our slightly older nephew, who's pre-teen, and his is going to be a bit more, you know, cool, and so he's just working on that right now. So keep an eye out on our Facebook and Instagram accounts, and we'll post that when that's ready too. So if you make this bag yourself, make sure that you tag us on Instagram or Facebook. We love to see what you guys make. If you've got any questions or you're having any trouble with the pattern, you can always contact us by email, countrycowdesigns@gmail.com, or you can just leave a comment here in the video. Thank you so much for watching, and keep an eye out for future patterns that we've got coming out in the coming months. We really hope that you enjoyed this video, and if so, please give it a thumbs up. Thanks!